Hi everyone, so we've got a really important lesson here. I think this is an absolutely huge theme that you really need to have an excellent understanding of, okay? It's about the middle income trap and whether China might actually fall victim to the so-called middle income trap, also known as the Latin American trap by Xi Jinping. Okay, so let's take a look firstly at what this is. It represents a country who no longer has comparative advantage in manufacturing, okay? Yet they cannot compete with MEDC's high value added goods sector. So they're stuck in the middle in essence, okay? They're unable to actually invest significant amounts to develop their economy to become advanced, wealthy nations. Now, if you think about Mexico, Brazil, many other Latin American countries like Argentina, Chile, and so on, many of those countries are stuck in this middle income trap, and it does pose real problems. Only 20 countries have actually made it beyond this this barrier, this boundary that seems to exist in economic development. So it's a really, really important phenomenon. Okay, now we're going to split this up into two aspects, this lesson. So one looking at, yes, this is really likely to happen, and one arguing, no, it can be avoided. Okay, so we'll break this down, and therefore it's likely to be quite long, because you can see the content is quite heavy here. Okay, but it's a really, really important one. I think this could feature in your essays quite significantly. So yeah, really make sure you get to know this very well. Okay, so let's look at the arguments as to why this may well happen for China. Well, in fact, China has actually been a middle income country for the last 25 years. They've actually developed into that middle income status for 25 years. Now, further to that, they've actually been higher middle income country for a further 8 years. Now, this is interesting, particularly when you put it in context of those countries that have developed more recently, those so-called NICs, newly industrialized countries of South Korea and Taiwan. South Korea, it took them 23 years, just 23 years, to progress from being middle income to then moving towards MEDC status and increasing their per capita income quite significantly. Taiwan, slightly slower, 27 years, and Singapore, it took 29 years. So we can see that China has already taken 25. Now this is really interesting, because what this tells us is that their comparative advantage in manufacturing will be eroded over this sort of period of time. Therefore, they need to make the shift to ensure that they can compete with MEDCs in these high value added goods. In essence, they seem to be running out of a little bit of time here. Now, there's some excellent Asia Society videos that you can have a look at on YouTube, which have all sorts of information. They're quite long, they're quite lengthy, and they're very in depth. But I've tried to summarize some of this information for you here. Okay, so yeah, it's just interesting how China seems to be running out of time. Now, further to this, their current GDP per capita around about $8,700. Okay, they need to reach $12,300 to go beyond that middle income status and become more of a very wealthy, prosperous, newly industrialized country. Okay, and really, the findings produced from the Asian Society suggest that this process needs to happen in the next 5 years. Of course, the Chinese don't necessarily agree with this, but yeah, it's just interesting to have that Western versus the Eastern perspective there. Okay, so the essence here really is that China could well be running out of time. So they've got to invest significantly in developing innovation, developing creative industries, so that they can compete with those high value added goods that MEDCs can produce. Progress on reforms, as we've seen, has been very, very slow, and of course this does raise some concerns. But it's also worthwhile noting that innovation, of course, is one of those areas where there does seem to be some positive reform being made, okay, albeit perhaps at the expense of foreign firms and foreign investment. And as we've discussed, that does pose problems as well. Okay, so China has been a middle-income country for 8 years. Sorry, a high middle-income country. Only 20 countries have made it beyond this boundary. So it's a really significant point, this, okay, that they need to get beyond this. They need to industrialise, further industrialise. They need to further urbanise their workers. And so, yeah, it's just really important that they work towards improving the potential for creativity and inspiration in their economy. Finally, avoiding the trap has always required liberal institutions that inspire creativity. So this is, again, a potential source of concern for China, that of course we've seen that China doesn't tend to like liberal institutions. It's not an economy which is necessarily about freedom, so it does involve the state having to actually relinquish some control here. Okay, so that's a really interesting point. And the question is, can they actually do that? Well, we know they are producing a lot of graduates every year. We know there are some improvements being made in innovation, but they do need to liberalise their competitive environment to really inspire and ignite innovation further. Okay, and all of our findings previously lead through to this point, what we've looked at within the solo model and so on. Okay, now you may want to pause the video there and just have a little run through these points again. Just see if you can go back and explain each of these points in turn. Okay, and get going again when you're ready to start. Okay. Right. Having done that, I hope you've been able to test yourself a little bit on how you've got on in going back through these and self-elaborating those. Okay, so let's look at the arguments suggesting that no, actually China can avoid this trap. Okay, so firstly, this is a wonderful point, and it really does indicate quite extensive, intricate knowledge of the Chinese economy. If you were able to demonstrate this in an essay, the 12 provinces are actually above the threshold for a middle income country already. So actually, some provinces have already made it beyond. Perhaps it's only because China is so vast that that could actually hold them back. Now, it's unlikely, highly unlikely, in fact, that all provinces will actually make it beyond this threshold in the next 5 or possibly even 10 years, because there are some provinces that do not possess any real comparative advantages. Further to that, they're landlocked, and that's another barrier to development. Okay, so but nevertheless, this is very encouraging. Okay, and of course that fits within the deliberately unbalanced nature of the economic growth that China has really bet its stakes on there. Okay, right. Next point. They've also got, they would argue, in China, a comparative advantage in China through their institutional advantages. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that China, of course, has their state-owned enterprises, they have the Communist Party, and they can therefore direct exactly what should happen according to both the state-owned enterprises and the Communist Party themselves. So the Chinese believe that this is something that just was not present within the Latin American countries when they reached this threshold and failed to get beyond there. So they've really taken some of the lessons of the Latin American experience on board, and we know that they want to do it differently. Xi Jinping is not a reformer, okay? He wants to maintain the Communist Party and the Communist Party rule, of course. So one of the ways in which they hope to break beyond this is by using SOEs and the Communist Party to direct what sort of research and development and innovation should be taking place. Next point is really that China have really studied the Latin America trap. Okay, so they're really aware of this. And as we said earlier, Xi Jinping refers to this middle income trap as the Latin America trap. So they've really got a good idea of what they think they need to do to ensure that they don't fall foul to this problem. Okay. Next point, we've got 7 million graduates graduating from Chinese universities every year. So in effect, if we think back to the solo model there and the importance of education and improving the labour productivity and efficiency, it's a really important point that, of course, you could debate about the quality of some of those graduates and the universities they're graduating from, but nevertheless, there's going to be a significant talent pool there. And of course, China is adding to that further by allowing 10-year visas for foreign workers with high skills, as well as trying to bring back some of their tech talent from overseas. There's also the potential, of course, for reform of the hukou system, and by reforming that system, it would help to reduce the amount of savings that take place and fuel more domestic-based demand. And that, of course, would lead to greater consumption, and greater consumption would lead to better profits for those firms that are designing more sophisticated consumer goods. Companies like Xiaomi, for instance, Great Wall Motors, Li Ning sports company. Those sorts of companies would then have more profits to actually, supernormal profits to reinvest and focus on their long-term dynamic efficiency. Okay, and final point really is this importance of generating that total factor productivity through innovation. Okay, inspiration, not perspiration. It's about ensuring that the overall productivity of their resources increases and they move towards that more intensive growth model, rather than simply relying upon inputting more and more factors of production into the output process. Okay, that's exhaustive, and they're going to reach a point where it isn't possible to grow any longer on that basis. Okay, so there we go. That's a nice breakdown of the arguments as to why this may happen and why it can be avoided. Okay, it's going to be interesting to see how this goes for sure over the next 5 years or so. Hope that's useful. Thank you.